Thank you for joining us on the Jimmy Daytona Show. This fine evening, I have my friend Eddie Masters, the new author of Clocking into Hell, which is his firsthand experience working in a factory that specialized in detonators for mining and construction. He's an avid writer and reader, and I'm looking forward to hearing his insights about his book and about other books that inspired him to write his new book. And thank you so much for coming on, Eddie.
My pleasure, Jim.
What led you to write this book?
Any number of things, actually. There were so many stories, so many events, so many things that stood out when I worked in that factory. And so many people down there had said, I'd like to write a book about this. I want to write a book about this. I'm going to write a book about this. But as far as I know, nobody ever followed through. I'm, as far as I know, the only one who did follow through. And it's a catharsis of sorts. And it also is going to give people an insight as to what people who work in that type of atmosphere and under those types of conditions, what they have to put up with on a day-to-day and a year-to-year basis from all ends of the spectrum, both from management and labor. And it's not only going to be about bad things that happen, it's also going to be stories about funny things that happen and good things that happen too. It's going to cover the whole gamut of the human experience.
Wow, good stuff. What were some of the good and fun parts of that job?
Well, sometimes we would have a pizza party every now and then, especially around Christmas time. I would buy my coworkers in my building pizza the day before the Christmas shutdown, because we used to shut down every year between Christmas Eve and New Year's Day. So anybody who wasn't on vacation, I bought them all pizza. And company picnics every year they had, usually at the end of August. And occasionally they would have luncheons down there, things like that. And we did have a few good bosses down there too. Not all the bosses were bad, although the bad ones were really bad. Most of the people who worked down there were fine. But again, the bad ones who worked down there, they really stood out, and they were just reprehensible people. So, but like I said, it's not going to be all one-sided. It's going to cover both the good and the bad down there.
Yeah, well, you guys said the devil wears Prada. The devil, makes detonators.
Yeah, that would have been another good title for the book.
Yeah, one of my fellow Cornell alum, Lauren Weisberger, wrote a pretty thinly disguised account of her time at Vogue magazine, and I thought of that book when you told me about Clocking into Hell.
Mm-hmm. In a way, I mean, I never read the book I'm about to describe to you, but years ago, my father read the book The Choirboys by Joseph Wambaugh. And he was a police officer for many years. I believe it was in Los Angeles, if I remember right. And I think his book was like a thinly veiled autobiography of his experiences in that police department. They eventually turned it into a movie back around 1977 it was. And I remember as a kid, when my father was reading this book, he was laying on the couch laughing as he was reading this book. My father's an avid reader too, to this day at 86 years old.
Nice.
And that's the only book, as far as I can remember, that I ever saw him and heard him laugh out loud at. And it didn't dawn on me until I got into this book that, maybe this book will do for factory life what the Choirboys did for life inside of a police department.
Wow. So what were up with the bad bosses? Why were they terrible? What did they do to you, and what did they do to the other your other colleagues?
They just seemed to get their jollies out of making people's lives miserable. I don't know what it was. And a lot of times they came from other areas that they got fired for from serious offenses, or they just, like I said, they were just miserable people who just loved firing people or suspending people. As somebody down there once put it to me, it's bad enough when you're working with potentially dangerous material and then have them play these stupid little head games with you. Those are the types of things that we had to deal with as far as the bad supervisors and management down there were concerned. And a lot of them were just, even if they just weren't actively bad, they were just downright incompetent. And it shows in the fact that the place no longer exists. It closed down completely. I think it was back in 2014.
Oh, wow. What kind of jobs did you do for that company?
building I worked in most of the time there, I did any number of different things. I ran first when I started there, I inspected things that was coming down the track for defects. And if I found too many defects, I would have to pull the work and have it 100% inspected. Later on, I actually ran the machine themselves that made the product, packed it out, stamped it with my number and the BATF code, which was actually the date it was made, and sent it down the track. Eventually, what they did was one of the supervisors there, he put me on as the foreman, which meant that I got everybody their supplies for running the machines, all the wire, the boxes, the cartons and such, helped the leaders out, made sure that we were well stocked with everything, emptied the garbage, anything just to keep the building running smoothly. That was a part of it that I enjoyed the most because it gave me a bit more freedom to move around rather than stay stationary in one spot for a few hours at a time before our break.
Wow, neat. Yeah. How long were you employed at that company and what made you decide to move on from it?
Okay. Well, I was employed there. I was hired there in 1990 when I was about 23 years old and stayed there until about 2003 when they had a massive layoff there. I volunteered for that layoff, although I could have stayed. But the scuttlebutt that was going around the plant at the time was that it was only going to be there 2 more years, and then they were going to ship all the equipment over to the sister plant in Simsbury, Connecticut, and then shut down completely. That eventually happened, but it didn't happen in 2005. It happened between 2010 and 2014. I came back in 2006 because they were rehiring people, and they made me an offer I couldn't refuse.
Oh.
I got my pay rate back. I got my vacation time back. The only thing I didn't get back was my seniority. But with the pay rates, you couldn't. By the time I left there for the last time, when I was laid off in 2009, I was making nearly $20 an hour, and that translated, including overtime and everything. 2009, I made over $45,000 a year, and
wow.
And even though the last 4 months of that year I was laid off, but I still cleared over $45,000, which was good money for back then, especially in this area.
Wow.
So the last time I left, it was I was laid off, but and they told me it was only. And here's another example of the type of management we had down there. I was laid off, and I was told by the human resources manager that it was only going to be a temporary layoff, maybe for a month, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. Those were his exact words. Little more than 2 weeks later, I get my 401k rollover papers in the mail. And I was like, what is this? The last time I got this is when I got laid off in 2003. And then about a month after I got laid off, I got an email from a now departed coworker, Tom Kozlowski, may he rest in peace. And the email told me that the place was closing in 2010. So that told me then and there that I was probably never going to come back. And that was the reason why, I got laid off, didn't come back. And I couldn't understand why they didn't bring me back, because they could have brought me back a couple of months later. They were running overtime in my building. And every time I had to go to unemployment to give them a record of job searches and everything, I would tell them all the stunts that they were pulling down there and how they were, jerking me along, pulling my leg, giving me the runaround, and so on and so forth, because that's just the way they were. The kicker of it was the last contact I had with them. They called me back to work in September of 2010 to a building I had never worked in before, and on the midnight shift. It was like the Wednesday through Sunday shift. And he told me that you're probably not going to want to come back because you're going to school. And I said, no, I'll come back. I said, I'll just make arrangements with my advisor at the school I was going to at the time, which was up in Troy, New York, Hudson Valley Community College. And he said, I'll call unemployment. I'll call the head of the boiler house to tell you you're coming back. I didn't hear anything from them for about a week. So I call up down there a week later, and they told me that the reason I wasn't coming back now was because they forgot to put the bid up after that guy quit the boiler house before they offered me the job, which I knew was a lot of nonsense. The only reason they offered me the job to begin with was because they were hoping I would say no, so then they could call up unemployment and cut my benefits off. That's what that was all about. But I called their bluff.
Well, that's outstanding. That company was in Saugerties. Do you have
the
company?
No, it was just south of Saugerties, just south of Kingston, New York. It was in a small town called Port Ewan, New York, just south of Kingston, maybe about 85 miles north of New York City.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. And it went under ownership, several different ownerships, several different names. Originally, it was called Hercules. That was before I started there. And then Hercules sold it to Irico Incorporated in 1985. And Dyno Nobel was always the parent company of Irico, and they officially changed their name over to Dyno Nobel around the spring or summer of 1993.
Wow.
Like I said, this is just an inkling of the stories I have to tell in this book. I'm just getting started. I could spend the whole night here, but I don't want to ruin it for everybody.
Yeah. Well, what are like, do you have like a good, bad, and ugly takeaway for people, to whet their appetites? They go buy this book.
Well, the people who buy this book are going to get an insider's view of what happens in a factory. Taylor Caldwell wrote the book years ago, Captains and the Kings, and it was a thinly disguised view of the Kennedy family. And then there was the book, The Greek Tycoon, which was about Aristotle Onassis, thinly veiled disguise. And then the religious book, Malachi Martin's Windswept House, was also a thinly veiled disguise of what's going on in the Catholic Church since the 1960s. And all the financial, sexual, liturgical, and all kinds of corruption that we've seen in recent years and still continue to see in some cases. But it's going to give, as far as I know, hi Nefertiti, as far as I know, no one has ever written a book from this perspective. You have exposés and like I said, thinly veiled disguise books and works from different types of professions, but never, as far as I know, from this one. Jim Bouton, Ball 4. There's another one.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of things about that one. It was pretty outrageous.
Oh, yeah.
He's pulling the veil back at Major League Baseball clubhouses.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah. He took a lot of heat for that, too.
Wow. Yeah, I know one of the things you mentioned to start the book off is George Carlin's quote. It's called The American Dream because you need to be asleep
to believe it. Yeah, exactly.
So what inspired you to pick that quote in particular about this book, and about your work experience clocking into hell?
Well, before he made that quote, he described how the American workers were getting screwed over. The loss of benefits, the loss of overtime, the disappearing pension that disappears when you go to collect it, and so on and so forth. And he had his fingers on the pulse of what was going on long before anybody else did. And seeing how many manufacturing jobs in this country have disappeared over the years, yeah, that was one of the reasons I chose his quote. Some of the people who worked down there, they thought they were going to retire down there. I mean, I never thought I was going to stay down there as long as I was, much less till retirement. As a whole, I stayed down there a grand total of 16 years. But some people had 20-something years down there when they were laid off back in 2003. I mean, granted, they got unemployment. Granted, they got severance pay. But and for some people, it was just they could not believe that place would ever close. And even the man I mentioned earlier to you, my former coworker, Tom Kozlowski, he said, this place will be here when I'm gone. Well, unfortunately, it didn't turn out that way. And it's a track record of broken promises, and the things that they said were going to happen didn't happen, and the things that they said would never happen did happen.
Yeah, that's sometimes how life plays out. That's sometimes how dysfunctional companies play out.
Yeah, and unfortunately, like a lot of other these companies, you're just a name and a number there. They don't really care. Not I shouldn't say all of them, not all of them, but a lot of them that just didn't care about the type of work you did. If they didn't like you, they just want to get rid of you. They didn't care what kind of a worker you were. And in some cases, they succeeded with other people. I was very good at covering my tracks and covering my butt, so to speak. But this is exactly some of the nonsense people had to put up with down there from that company, and even from the union, because there were some people in the union that didn't really care about anybody but themselves.
Wow. So how did you navigate these interpersonal clashes? Dysfunctional managers, selfish union folks. How did you stay above the fray? And were there times that you ended up getting targeted anyway?
Well, sometimes I would just confront them or just stand up for myself. Other times, though, and here was a key component, and this makes somebody dangerous to cross swords with. If you have dirt on somebody, they'll leave you alone. And any walk of life, if you have dirt on somebody, they don't want to risk doing you in because you can hurt them somewhere down the road.
Yeah, mutual destruction.
Yeah, especially if they're doing something very illegal, which some of them were doing down there.
Oh, wow.
So that's one of the ways I protected myself, was that they knew that crossing swords with me, I had the memory of an elephant, and I didn't even have to write anything down, as a diary of sorts. I didn't have to do that because I had the memory of an elephant. And when I wrote this book, what I did was I would start, at the year I started, and I would continue. And sometimes I would remember something that happened in a previous chapter, previous year, and I have to go back and fill it in. That was one of the ways I handled some of the conflicts down there. Sometimes I had friends down there. I didn't even have to open up my mouth on my own behalf. They opened up their own mouths for me and set them straight. So there was, it depended on, it was a case by case basis, whether it was a coworker, whether it was management, whether it was somebody at the union. Yeah, but people talked down there. That was the other thing too. People talked. And when somebody got fired, got suspended, flunked their drug test, even cut their hand in an accident, it was news from one end of the plant to the other in no time. And that was just like an aspect of factory life.
What kind of illegal stuff went down that you took notice of?
Drugs. There were some people, including management, into drugs. I knew that for a fact.
Wow.
Yeah. And some people,
explosive material, what could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, exactly. And making the poor decisions that they made. Besides, some people were stealing things, not just from supplies from the company, but they were stealing things off the plant, or they were involved in illegal activities off the plant. That type of thing. I
see.
Yeah. So some people used to like to beat up their girlfriends or their wives. It was it was any number of different things that the people down there that were no good, that were involved in, that they had no business being involved in. And I would never poke around to try to find it. People would come to me voluntarily for this information. And to this day, I don't know why, sometimes people would just come up to me and say, "Hey, did you hear about what happened to this one? They got nailed in a drunk driving this past weekend." I said, "Get out of here." And then, sure enough, you'd read the local paper, and there it was in the law and order section. They would get picked up drunk driving. And they had the other thing down there too is they had drug and alcohol testing. If you got into an accident or a mishap and you flunked your drug test, you got suspended, and you couldn't come back until you were clean. And then from that point on, they could test you at random. And then if you flunked a second time, you were fired. Otherwise, you would get drug and alcohol tested like maybe every couple of years when you went up to the nurse's office to take your physical. So those were some of the things that people were doing that were either dangerous or illegal.
Wow, that's walking the tightrope, especially given the line of industry.
Exactly, because you're not only putting yourself at risk, you're putting your coworkers at risk. And it's funny we're mentioning this, and we're discussing this right now about dangerous behavior down there. Today's the anniversary of when two guys got killed down on that plant back in 1995, July 19th, 1995. I'll never forget the day. There was an explosion down there. A contractor and a company worker got killed. They were storing material. The company was storing materials in a building they had no business storing in there, an ignition powder and an explosive powder in the same building. You can't do that because it violates BATF rules and regulations. But the company did it. And then the contractor went to fix a door. He wasn't using non-sparking tools, and he didn't go get a hot work permit for working in sensitive areas. So he was fixing the door, banging on it, a spark went off, boom, it went off like a cannon. And it was 27 years ago today.
Wow, what a tragedy.
Yeah.
That is awful.
And to show you, it made the New York Times, and it made the New York City television news when that happened.
I mean, how did you take it at that time? How did the coworkers take it? It must have been a really sobering experience to know that one of their own.
Well, many of my coworkers, understandably, were very upset that they lost a coworker and a friend, particularly. The contractor that got killed, He had a very cocky, arrogant attitude that nothing was going to happen to him. Nobody deserved to die that way. But at the same time, nobody had any use for his attitude because he did a lot of dangerous things down there. But yeah, a lot of people, like I said, they were upset to the point of crying because he got the coworker got killed. And other people were upset about the fact that they were angry at management for that whole thing happening. So that was a general feeling of what was going on down there at the time. But we knew an accident was going to happen sooner or later because there was a series of events and unsafe things that happened down there that the safety committee never followed up on, that management never followed up on. And, you know, it wasn't a question as to if, but when something, you know, tragic would happen.
Man, it's pretty sobering.
Yeah.
How long did it take you to write this book?
I started it during when the pandemic shutdown, the COVID lockdown. I had been wanting to write it for years, but I was either taking online courses or going to school or working. I just didn't have the time to start one because I had too many irons in the fire. Finally, near the end of the lockdown is when I started it. So I figured it was around May of 2020, I started it. And I was adding things here and there as when I had the time and as I remembered it. I also kept like a little log book to keep my notes all straightened out as reference points. And I finished it just after Easter Sunday this year. And it's about 388 pages long. I just wanted to make sure I didn't miss a trick.
Did you have documents from back in the day, or like you said, you have a memory of an elephant? You were able to retrace the steps
Yeah.
working there way back when.
I was able to retrace the steps in my mind, and doing it on a year-by-year basis took longer to do, but at the same time, you know, a more accurate retelling of events based on events that it was based on.
Yeah. How's been trying to find a publisher going? Like, who have you reached out to? Like, do you have any agents?
I found a publisher through a friend on Facebook who also wrote a book about a completely different topic. It's called Ex Libris Publishing. They've got the book, the layout, the cover layout, the inside. They got it just about all set. Matter of fact, just before we did this podcast, I had to sign a couple of online documents, and it's just about ready to be published. And it's funny, like I said, we're discussing this day, the anniversary of the accident, which I thought that it was a touch of irony there.
Yeah, it's a sad day, a sad anniversary there for sure. Have you been into writing for a while, or did you take it up?
I used to write for a now defunct online magazine on Facebook. It was a Catholic magazine. I wrote any number of different articles about historical events and individual personages. That's where I first really developed my my skill for writing, I guess you could say. Nothing, you know, the length of a book, but for example, I wrote about the Star of Bethlehem one time and what it possibly was. And I had seen things on the History Channel and Arts and Entertainment years ago about that same subject, and I sort of remembered things that they had discussed about what it possibly was back then. That's where I really started developing my writing. And I remember my editor at the time told me that I was one of the few writers she had that needed like the least amount of editing work. So I said, oh, maybe I could do something else with this someday. And I think maybe in the back of my mind, I thought that this gave me a good base to write this book someday.
Well, it's good you had good practice with with that magazine.
Yeah.
Do you want to write more after this book is done? And if so, like, what might you want to write about? Would you want a full-length book, essays, short stories?
Well, depending upon the success of this book, and I don't see why it shouldn't be, it shouldn't do too badly. I'll probably write a book about Halloween and Christmas.
Separate. That's pretty random.
Yeah, completely.
What's that signify?
Yeah, completely different topics. Well, Halloween is very big these days. Halloween is the second most biggest commercial holiday after Christmas, and I would probably just write like a history of Halloween. I'm sure there's been other books written about that, but another one won't hurt from a different perspective. And I'm also thinking about writing a book about an aspect of Christmas that's been long forgotten, and people are going to be surprised. And it sort of relates to Halloween. Christmas ghost stories. many people don't realize that the ghost stories are also part of Christmas. You saw it obviously in Dickens' A Christmas Carol, where Scrooge was visited by 4 ghosts that night. But there are other Christmas ghost stories too that have to be researched and delved into. Even that Christmas story, the Christmas Carol, excuse me, it's the most wonderful time of the year. There's a line in there, there'll be scary ghost stories of Christmases long, long ago.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
How can people get a hold of you, for this book? Do you have a website or other pages that people can reach out to you on?
Well, I don't have a website. I am on Facebook. You can look me up on Facebook, Eddie Masters. Also, you can email me, Trajan2720 at AOL.com. Trajan is in the Roman Emperor Trajan, or the font size. Either one will work.
Nice.
So if anybody wants to contact me or ask me how to get a hold of a copy of this book once it's published, or discuss it, I'll be more than happy to.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading it myself.
Mm-hmm.
And anything else you want to add for our listeners of the Jimmy Daytona Show before we wind things up?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head, although I think people are really going to enjoy this book because it's not all gloom and doom. A lot of funny stories in there. As I said, it covers all the gamut of human emotions and all the gamut of human anger, happiness, sadness, tragedy, you name it. There's going to be funny stories in there. People are going to really like. They're going to laugh out loud at some of these stories that I tell in this book. As I said, it sort of reminded me of Joseph Wambaugh's The Choirboys earlier. So there's going to be some damn serious topics and weighty material in there. Also, not going to be completely gloom and doom, downhearted. Going to be some cheerfulness in there as well. Give you an example. One day, a manager down there, he had been there for some time. Nobody could stand him. And they finally fired him. And the day they fired him, there was a celebration in that parking lot at work that I never saw before or since. And my supervisor at the time, a guy named Greg Doyle, great guy, may he rest in peace. He unfortunately died back in 2019 of cancer. He even told me, he said, I never saw so many happy smiling faces down here. And I remember driving around that parking lot with my radio blasting the Who at full throttle. But yeah, those are some of the stories that people are going to read about and enjoy. Sense of satisfaction in a lot of certain situations. And you'll also see some of the injustices that were done to some of the people down there through the years, just because they weren't liked. And
company politics.
Of course, and it's that way. I imagine just about everywhere, any workplace really. There's personality conflicts. There's foibles, prejudices. Call them what you want, but if somebody doesn't like you, they'll try to get rid of you by hook or by crook, no matter what kind of a job you do.
Very true. It's like you have a unique experience, with Dino Nobel, but a lot of what you learned and went through is a universal story to share.
Sure.
A lot of people, who've been working at pretty intense workplaces.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for coming on the Jimmy Daytona Show, Eddie. It's Eddie Masters, the new author of Clocking into Hell. I can't wait for it to come out, and I'm sure it'll be a very entertaining read, when the time comes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, James, for having me.
All right.
All right. You take care of yourself.
All right.